15 Golden Age starlets who married the ugliest husbands. Hollywood's Golden Age gave us some of the most stunning women ever to grace the silver screen. Luminous beauties whose faces launched 1,000 magazines and whose glamour defined an era. These goddesses of cinema could have had any man they wanted, which makes their actual choices all the more baffling. Behind the carefully crafted publicity photos and studio-arranged romances, these screen sirens made matrimonial decisions that left fans scratching their heads and gossip columnists struggling to explain the inexplicable. While these actresses captivated audiences with their beauty, talent, and charisma, they often went home to husbands who, to put it kindly, wouldn't have made the cut as leading men in their own right. Today, we're exploring one of Hollywood's most perplexing phenomena: the stunning starlets who said "I do" to men who made audiences ask, "Why him?" Some of these marriages were brief disasters, others surprisingly enduring. Some were cynical business arrangements, others genuine love matches. But all of them featured a dramatic imbalance in the looks department that left the public wondering what these screen goddesses saw in their decidedly unglamorous partners. Was it rebellion against studio control? A desperate search for intellectual stimulation? Or simply proof that beauty isn't everything, even in Hollywood? Let's find out as we count down 15 Golden Age starlets who married the ugliest husbands in Tinseltown history.
Ava and I would like to thank everybody for their many good wishes, and especially our boss, Mr. Louis B. Mayer.
1. Ava Gardner and Mickey Rooney. When 19-year-old Ava Gardner married Mickey Rooney in 1942, it created one of Hollywood's most visually jarring couples. Gardner was just beginning her ascent to becoming one of cinema's great beauties, a raven-haired vision whose exotic allure would soon make her the epitome of the femme fatale. Rooney, on the other hand, was, well, Mickey Rooney. She was a goddess. He was a gremlin with a studio contract. Standing just 5 feet 2 inches with a boyish face that never quite matured into conventional handsomeness, Rooney was Hollywood's #1 box office draw at the time, but certainly not for his looks. The contrast between the statuesque Gardner and the diminutive Rooney was so pronounced that it became the talk of Hollywood. When they walked into a room together, people actually gasped, recalled one MGM publicist. It was like watching Beauty and the Leprechaun. You couldn't help but wonder what she saw in him. What Gardner saw initially was star power. As a young contract player trying to build her career, marriage to Hollywood's biggest star offered professional advantages. What she quickly discovered, however, was that Rooney's ego far exceeded his physical stature, particularly when it came to his notorious womanizing. Mickey was the most oversexed man I've ever known, Gardner later wrote in her autobiography. I was just a kid and didn't know he was a serial cheater. He'd leave me sitting at home while he was out screwing everything that moved. The marriage lasted just 16 months before Gardner filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty. Rooney would go on to marry 7 more times, while Gardner eventually wed Frank Sinatra after a tumultuous marriage to bandleader Artie Shaw. I was a naive country girl who didn't know the ways of Hollywood men, Gardner later reflected. Mickey may have been a big star, but he was an even bigger disappointment. Despite her subsequent marriages to more conventionally handsome men, Gardner's brief union with Rooney remains one of Hollywood's most visually incongruous pairings. A mismatch that launched countless jokes and left fans wondering how America's #1 box office draw had managed to win the hand of one of cinema's greatest beauties.
I'm fully confident that in the end my husband will win this case.
2. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller. When America's most famous sex symbol married one of its most celebrated intellectuals in 1956, the headlines practically wrote themselves. Egghead marries hourglass, beauty in the brains, the genius and the goddess. She married a brain, but Hollywood couldn't believe the face that came with it. Marilyn Monroe, at the height of her fame and beauty, shocked the public by choosing Arthur Miller, a balding, bespectacled playwright nearly 11 years her senior, as her third husband. After marriages to working-class boy James Dougherty and sports icon Joe DiMaggio, Monroe's selection of the decidedly unglamorous Miller left many questioning her judgment. The reaction in Hollywood was disbelief, notes film historian Margaret Johnson. Monroe was the ultimate blonde bombshell, desired by millions, and she chose a serious intellectual who looked like an accountant. People couldn't reconcile the image of the sex goddess with the reality of her marrying someone who looked like everyone's high school English teacher. Monroe herself was well aware of the public perception. "I hate to say this, but I don't think people want to see me married to an intellectual," she confided to a friend. That isn't the image. The image is a girl standing over a subway grating with her dress blowing up. For Monroe, however, Miller represented something she desperately craved: intellectual validation. Having spent her career being valued primarily for her body, Miller's appreciation of her mind and spirit offered a respect she hadn't found with more conventionally attractive men. Arthur was different, Monroe's acting coach Paula Strasberg later recalled. He saw past the blonde hair and the figure. He saw Marilyn's vulnerability, her intelligence, her desire to be taken seriously. For a woman who'd spent her life being treated as a beautiful object, that was intoxicating. Unfortunately, the marriage that began with such promise ended in heartbreak. Miller, who had initially seemed to cherish Monroe's complexity, grew increasingly frustrated with her insecurities and dependencies. After writing a thinly veiled and unflattering portrayal of her in his screenplay for The Misfits, Monroe felt betrayed by the man she had trusted to see her true self. "I thought he would understand and protect me," Monroe reportedly told her masseur shortly before their 1961 divorce. "Instead, he put all my neuroses on the screen for everyone to see." Their 5-year marriage, though ultimately unsuccessful, remains one of Hollywood's most fascinating studies in contrasts: physical, intellectual, and temperamental. It also represents a poignant chapter in Monroe's quest to be valued for more than her beauty, even if that meant choosing a partner whose looks were the antithesis of Hollywood's glamorous ideal.
I don't like that, no. But tell me more. I never lived that way.
Isn't that what it's all about?
No.
3. Hedy Lamarr and Jean Markey. In the pantheon of Hollywood beauty, few stars shone as brightly as Hedy Lamarr. With her perfect symmetrical features, luminous dark eyes, and alabaster skin, Lamarr was widely considered the most beautiful woman in the world during her heyday in the 1940s. Her exquisite looks were so remarkable that they sometimes overshadowed both her considerable acting talent and her brilliant mind. She was an inventor who developed a frequency-hopping signal that became a precursor to modern WIFI technology. Given her extraordinary beauty, fans were particularly puzzled by her 1939 marriage to Jean Markey, a screenwriter and producer whose physical appearance could charitably be described as distinctive. She was called the most beautiful woman alive and still said yes to that chin. Markey, who was 18 years Lamarr's senior, sported an unusually weak chin, a receding hairline, and a generally soft, doughy appearance that stood in stark contrast to Lamarr's flawless features. Hollywood wags joked that Markey looked more like Lamarr's accountant than her husband. "Hedy could have had any man in Hollywood, probably in the world," noted one contemporary columnist. Why she chose Jean Markey was a mystery that kept the gossip columnists busy for months. The answer may have lain in Markey's intellectual and social connections. A Yale-educated writer who moved in sophisticated circles, Markey offered Lamarr, an Austrian immigrant still finding her footing in America, entree into a world of culture and refinement. Jean was highly intelligent and extremely well-connected, explains film historian Robert Thompson. For Hedy, who was brilliant herself but often underestimated due to her beauty, Markey's intellectual credentials and social standing were attractive qualities that transcended physical appearance. The marriage, however, was short-lived, lasting barely a year before ending in divorce in 1941. Lamarr would go on to marry 5 more times, suggesting that finding lasting romantic happiness proved more elusive than success in Hollywood or scientific innovation. Interestingly, Markey himself had quite a track record with beautiful actresses, despite his unremarkable looks. Before Lamarr, he had been married to actress Joan Bennett, and after their divorce, he would go on to wed Myrna Loy, proving that in Hollywood, power and connections could often compensate for a less-than-perfect face.
But that was so small. But Joan let me interfere for one moment.
4. Lana Turner and Lex Barker. Unlike many entries on our list, Lana Turner's 4th husband, Lex Barker, wasn't physically unattractive in the conventional sense. Best known for playing Tarzan in 5 films during the late 1940s and early 1950s, the 6'4" Barker possessed the chiseled features and impressive physique that had made him believable as Edgar Rice Burroughs' jungle hero. But physical appearance can mask a much uglier reality, as Turner would discover in one of Hollywood's most disturbing marriages. Good cheekbones couldn't cover what was rotten underneath. Turner, the glamorous blonde whose discovery at Schwab's drugstore, actually the Top Hat Cafe, had become Hollywood legend, married Barker in 1953 at the height of her fame. Initially, they seemed a well-matched pair physically, both blessed with the kind of movie star looks that graced fan magazines and movie posters, but behind closed doors a much darker dynamic was playing out. In 1981, Turner's daughter Cheryl Crane revealed in her autobiography that Barker had sexually abused her when she was 13 years old during his marriage to Turner. "My mother was absolutely devastated when I finally told her what had been happening," Crane later recalled. "She threw him out immediately and never spoke to him again." Turner divorced Barker in 1957, but kept the true reason for their separation private for many years, protecting both her daughter's privacy and her own reputation in an era when such matters were rarely discussed publicly. "Lana put up a front for the public, but she never forgave herself for not protecting her daughter," says Hollywood biographer Ann Edwards. "She carried that guilt and rage for the rest of her life." Barker's case illustrates a crucial truth often overlooked in discussions of Hollywood marriages. Physical attractiveness can conceal profound ugliness of character. While most mismatched couples on our list represent visual incongruity, Turner and Barker's marriage reminds us that the most important qualities in a partner have nothing to do with outward appearance. After divorcing Barker, Turner would marry twice more, bringing her total to 7 husbands, a marital history that reflected both the romantic turbulence of her life and perhaps an ongoing search for a trustworthy partner after such profound betrayal. Barker, meanwhile, continued his acting career primarily in European films, particularly German westerns, before his death in 1973. His legacy remains permanently tainted by Crane's revelations, a stark reminder that handsomeness and moral character exist on entirely separate spectrums.
Ridiculous fight is one of the greatest exercises in marital togetherness.
5. Elizabeth Taylor and Larry Fortensky. By 1991, Elizabeth Taylor had been married 7 times to 6 different men. She married and divorced Richard Burton twice. Her husbands had included hotel heir Conrad Nicky Hilton, actor Michael Wilding, producer Mike Todd, singer Eddie Fisher, and politician John Warner, most of whom were successful, conventionally attractive men who matched Taylor's status as Hollywood royalty, which made her 8th and final marriage all the more surprising. She went from diamonds to drywall. At Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch in October 1991, the 59-year-old Taylor married Larry Fortensky, a 39-year-old construction worker whom she had met while both were undergoing treatment at the Betty Ford Center. With his mullet hairstyle, rugged features, and decidedly blue-collar background, Fortensky represented a dramatic departure from Taylor's usual type. "It was like watching a Rolls-Royce park in front of a trailer park," quipped one Hollywood insider when the relationship became public. No one could figure out what Elizabeth Taylor, the most glamorous woman in the world, saw in this ordinary-looking construction worker. The wedding itself highlighted the incongruity of the match. Taylor wore a pale yellow dress designed by Valentino, while Fortensky rented a standard black tuxedo. Celebrities including Liza Minnelli, Eddie Murphy, and Nancy Reagan attended the ceremony, creating a surreal backdrop for a man more accustomed to construction sites than red carpets. "Larry looked completely out of place," recalled one wedding guest. "It wasn't just that he wasn't handsome in the conventional Hollywood sense, it was that he seemed bewildered by the whole spectacle, like a deer caught in headlights." Despite the skepticism, Taylor insisted the relationship was based on genuine affection. "Larry is wonderful because he doesn't have any preconceived notions about me," she told reporters. "He sees me as a woman, not as Elizabeth Taylor the star." Friends noted that after decades of high-profile, tumultuous relationships with famous men, Taylor found Fortensky's straightforward, unpretentious nature refreshing. He neither competed with her stardom nor tried to control her, qualities she had found lacking in more sophisticated partners. The marriage lasted 5 years before ending in divorce in 1996, with Taylor citing irreconcilable differences. Unlike many of her previous splits, however, the breakup was relatively amicable. Fortensky declined to seek spousal support, though Taylor did provide him with a settlement reported to be around $1 million. "Larry wasn't a bad guy," says Taylor biographer William Mann. "He just wasn't equipped for life with one of the world's most famous women." The gap in their backgrounds, education, and social circles proved too wide to bridge permanently. After their divorce, Fortensky largely retreated from public life, occasionally giving interviews but mostly returning to the anonymity he had known before meeting Taylor. He died in 2016 at the age of 64, having spent his final years living quietly with his sister in California. Taylor never married again after Fortensky, suggesting that her most unconventional marital choice may have been her last attempt to find happiness with a partner who wanted her for herself, rather than her fame, fortune, or legendary beauty.
Horseman and his ponies. I mean the Hollywood kind.
6. Jean Harlow and Paul Byrne. When platinum blonde bombshell Jean Harlow married MGM executive Paul Byrne in July 1932, it created one of Hollywood's most visually striking mismatches. Harlow, just 21 years old, was at the height of her fame and beauty, the original blonde sex symbol whose provocative performances in films like Red Dust and Hell's Angels had made her one of cinema's most desirable women. Byrne, by contrast, was a 42-year-old studio executive described variously as homely, balding, and physically unimpressive. Standing just 5 feet 5 inches with a slight build and receding hairline, Byrne's appearance left many wondering what Harlow saw in him. They called it a love story, but it ended like a murder mystery. The marriage shocked Hollywood, but what happened next stunned the world. Just 2 months after their wedding, on September 5, 1932, Byrne was found dead in their Benedict Canyon home, naked, with a bullet wound to his head and a bizarre suicide note nearby that referred to his temporary impotence. The official ruling was suicide, but rumors immediately began swirling about the true nature of Byrne's death and his relationship with Harlow. Some suggested that Byrne had a common-law wife who had murdered him out of jealousy. Others whispered that Harlow herself might have been involved, though she had a solid alibi, having spent the night at her mother's house. MGM went into full damage control mode, explains film historian Kevin Brownlow. Studio fixers were on the scene before the police, removing evidence and crafting the suicide narrative to protect both Harlow's reputation and the studio's investment in her career. The truth behind Byrne's death remains one of Hollywood's enduring mysteries, but what is clear is that the marriage itself was troubled from the start. Some biographers suggest that Byrne, who had a reputation as a woman's man rather than a ladies' man, may have been physically unable to consummate the marriage, a devastating revelation for a new bride, especially one seen as a sex symbol. Others speculate that the marriage was a business arrangement designed to provide cover for Harlow's alleged affair with MGM head Louis B. Mayer, while giving the socially awkward Byrne a beautiful wife to enhance his status in Hollywood's hierarchy. Whether it was a love match or a marriage of convenience, it ended in tragedy, notes Harlow biographer Eve Golden, and it left Jean with a shadow over her that never fully dissipated. Harlow herself never spoke publicly about Byrne's death. She returned to work just days after the tragedy, filming Red Dust with Clark Gable, and continued her career until her own untimely death from kidney failure in 1937 at the age of 26. The brief, tragic union between the screen's most famous blonde and the physically unimpressive studio executive remains one of Hollywood's most puzzling relationships, a strange marriage that ended in an even stranger death, leaving questions that have persisted for nearly a century.
You're so crazy. You don't know anything about me. We've spoken to each other a few times over the barbed wires and...
7. Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. When Ingrid Bergman, the luminous Swedish star of Casablanca, Notorious, and Spellbound, fell in love with Italian neo-realist director Roberto Rossellini in 1949, she didn't just risk her marriage. She risked her entire career and public standing in America. She left America for him and shocked the world with who she chose. Bergman, with her radiant beauty and wholesome image, had been one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses throughout the 1940s. When news broke that she was leaving her husband, Dr. Peter Lindstrom, and their young daughter to pursue a relationship with Rossellini, the public reaction was swift and merciless. The scandal intensified when Bergman became pregnant with Rossellini's child while still legally married to Lindstrom. She was denounced on the floor of the United States Senate as a powerful influence for evil, blacklisted by Hollywood studios, and effectively exiled from American screens for nearly a decade. What made the situation even more incomprehensible to the American public was Rossellini himself. While undeniably brilliant as a filmmaker, the Italian director was not conventionally handsome. Short, stocky, balding, and significantly older than Bergman, he presented a stark contrast to the actress's elegant beauty. Americans couldn't understand why Bergman would sacrifice everything, her marriage, her daughter, her career, her public adoration, for this rumpled Italian filmmaker who wasn't even good-looking, explains film historian David Thompson. It seemed like madness to them, which only reinforced the narrative that she had somehow lost her moral compass. What the public failed to understand was the intellectual and artistic connection that had developed between Bergman and Rossellini. Their relationship began with a simple letter Bergman wrote to the director after seeing his neo-realist masterpiece Rome, Open City, expressing her admiration for his work and her desire to collaborate professionally. Rossellini represented everything Hollywood wasn't: authentic, uncompromising, artistically pure, notes Bergman biographer Charlotte Chandler. For an actress increasingly frustrated by the limitations of studio filmmaking, he offered both artistic freedom and intellectual stimulation that transcended physical appearance. The couple married in 1950 after both obtained divorces from their previous spouses and went on to collaborate on 5 films together. They had 3 children, a son and twin daughters, one of whom, Isabella Rossellini, would later become a celebrated actress and model in her own right. The marriage lasted 7 years before ending in divorce in 1957. By then, the scandal had subsided enough for Bergman to return triumphantly to Hollywood with Anastasia, 1956, for which she won her 2nd Academy Award, a professional redemption that suggested America had finally forgiven her personal choices. In retrospect, what's most remarkable about the Bergman-Rossellini affair is how thoroughly it exposed American hypocrisy about sex, morality, and female autonomy, reflects film critic Molly Haskell. Bergman paid an enormous price for following her heart and her artistic instincts, simply because she was a woman who defied expectations, both in her actions and in her choice of partner. The Bergman-Rossellini relationship remains one of cinema's most consequential love stories, a passion that produced great art, changed lives, and challenged social norms, even as it puzzled those who couldn't see beyond the physical mismatch to the deeper connection that brought these two artists together.
You haven't been around lately. I thought maybe you were an amnesia victim or something.
8. Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles. When Rita Hayworth married Orson Welles in 1943, it united Hollywood's reigning sex goddess with its boy genius, a pairing that seemed perfect on paper, but proved deeply flawed in practice, not least because of the stark contrast between Hayworth's legendary beauty and Welles's increasingly disheveled appearance. She gave the world Gilda, he gave her self-doubt. Hayworth, born Margarita Cancino, had transformed herself from a Spanish dancer into Hollywood's ultimate glamour girl through painful electrolysis to raise her hairline, hair dye to change her black locks to vibrant red, and years of careful image crafting by Columbia Pictures. By 1943, she was one of the world's most desired women, her famous pin-up photo adorning the walls of countless GI barracks during World War II. Welles, the wunderkind who had revolutionized both theater and cinema before the age of 30, initially possessed a certain dark handsomeness. But even by the time of their marriage, his appearance was beginning to reflect his chaotic lifestyle, the beginning of the weight gain, rumpled attire, and general dishevelment that would characterize his later years. Rita was the epitome of carefully maintained Hollywood glamour, every hair in place, makeup perfect, clothes immaculate, notes Welles' biographer Simon Callow. Orson, by contrast, was increasingly careless about his appearance, more interested in his creative pursuits than in maintaining any kind of movie star image. This physical contrast symbolized deeper incompatibilities. Hayworth, despite her sex symbol status, was actually shy, insecure, and desperate for domestic stability after a traumatic childhood. Welles was restless, self-absorbed, and constitutionally incapable of providing the home life Hayworth craved. "I wanted a home and a family," Hayworth later reflected. Orson didn't want either. He was never there. When he was, his mind was always elsewhere. Perhaps most painfully for Hayworth, Welles seemed more interested in transforming her than appreciating her. In The Lady from Shanghai, 1947, the only film they made together, he insisted she cut off her famous long red hair and dye it blonde, symbolically destroying the image that had made her famous. Orson didn't want to be married to Rita Hayworth, she later observed bitterly. He wanted to be married to Rita Hayworth's image so he could tear it down. The marriage lasted just 3 years before ending in divorce in 1946, producing one daughter, Rebecca Welles. While brief, the union left lasting scars on Hayworth, who would marry 4 more times without finding lasting happiness. Welles, meanwhile, continued his pattern of brilliant but erratic creativity, his physical appearance deteriorating along with his Hollywood prospects as he aged. By the time of his death in 1985, the once handsome wunderkind had become enormously overweight and disheveled, a physical transformation that seemed to mirror his fall from Hollywood grace. The Hayworth-Welles marriage remains one of cinema's great might-have-beens, a union of extraordinary talents that collapsed under the weight of incompatible needs, competing egos, and perhaps most tellingly, Welles's inability to separate the woman from the image he both worshipped and resented.
Will you be returning this afternoon?
9. Gloria Swanson and Herbert K. Somborn. Before there was Norma Desmond, the faded silent film star of Sunset Boulevard, there was Gloria Swanson, the very real silent film queen who inspired aspects of that iconic character. At the height of her fame in the 1920s, Swanson was Hollywood royalty, commanding astronomical salaries, living in palatial mansions, and setting fashion trends worldwide with her elegant style and striking beauty, which made her 1919 marriage to Herbert K. Somborn all the more perplexing to Hollywood observers. She glowed like a star, and he looked like an accountant with indigestion. Somborn, the president of Equity Pictures, and later one of the founders of the Brown Derby restaurant, was a successful film executive, but far from a matinee idol. Portly, balding, and 15 years Swanson's senior, he presented a stark contrast to the glamorous actress whose face was adorning movie screens across America. Gloria could have had any man in Hollywood, noted one contemporary observer, that she chose someone who looked like Herbert raised eyebrows throughout the industry. The marriage, Swanson's second, was believed by many to be more strategic than romantic. As a powerful film executive, Somborn offered Swanson industry connections and business acumen that could help advance her already meteoric career. For his part, Somborn gained social status by having one of cinema's most beautiful women on his arm at industry functions. It was a classic Hollywood arrangement, explains film historian Janine Bassinger. She got power and industry knowledge, he got prestige and the envy of his peers. Whether there was genuine affection involved is harder to determine, but it certainly wasn't a match based on physical attraction. Whatever the initial basis for the union, it proved short-lived. The couple divorced in 1922 after just 3 years of marriage, with Swanson alleging that Somborn had numerous affairs during their time together, suggesting that perhaps he had used his position as husband to Hollywood's reigning queen to enhance his own romantic opportunities. The divorce took an ugly turn when Somborn counter-alleged that Swanson had engaged in immoral conduct with 13 different men, creating a scandal that threatened to derail her career. Ultimately, Swanson's star power proved resilient enough to withstand the negative publicity, and she continued as one of Hollywood's leading actresses throughout the 1920s. Swanson would marry 6 times in total, with her subsequent husbands, including a French marquis and an investment broker. Each marriage seemed to reflect her dual nature as both glamorous star and shrewd businesswoman, a combination that allowed her to amass and maintain considerable wealth even as her film career eventually waned. The Swanson-Somborn marriage, brief though it was, exemplifies a recurring pattern in Hollywood history: strategic unions that advance careers and consolidate power, regardless of physical compatibility or genuine romantic connection. In an industry built on illusion, perhaps it's not surprising that matrimony sometimes served purposes far removed from traditional notions of love and attraction. 10. Claudette Colbert and Joel Pressman. Claudette Colbert dominated Hollywood throughout the 1930s and 1940s with her sophisticated comedy performances, distinctive speaking voice, and famously perfect profile. So perfect, in fact, that she was filmed almost exclusively from the left side throughout her career, per her strict contractual requirements. Given her meticulous attention to visual presentation, many were surprised when the glamorous actress married Dr. Joel Pressman in 1935, beginning a union that would last until his death 33 years later. She conquered Hollywood and went home to a man no one recognized. Pressman, a throat specialist at UCLA Medical Center, was the antithesis of a Hollywood leading man. Short, balding, and described by contemporaries as pleasantly ordinary looking, he presented a stark contrast to Colbert's elegant beauty and screen charisma. While not unattractive in conventional terms, he was decidedly unexceptional in appearance, the kind of man who would blend into any crowd. If you saw them walking down the street together, you'd wonder what that ordinary-looking man was doing with Claudette Colbert, recalled one Hollywood contemporary. He looked more like her accountant than her husband. Adding to the public's curiosity was Pressman's notable absence from Hollywood's social life. Unlike many industry spouses who reveled in reflected glory, Pressman maintained his medical practice and rarely accompanied Colbert to film premieres, award ceremonies, or industry functions. Joel had zero interest in Hollywood, Colbert's friend and colleague Myrna Loy later recalled. He was a serious doctor who considered the film industry rather frivolous. He supported Claudette's career, but wanted no part of the glamour or attention. This separation of their professional lives, her in the spotlight, him in the operating room, puzzled industry observers, but apparently suited the couple perfectly. Friends noted that Colbert seemed to appreciate having a partner whose identity and self-worth weren't tied to her fame or success. Claudette was extraordinarily shrewd about people, notes film historian David Thompson. She recognized that most men in Hollywood would either compete with her success or try to control it. With Joel, she found someone who had his own identity and accomplishments completely separate from hers. The marriage thrived despite, or perhaps because of, this division between their public and private lives. While the general public rarely saw them together, those close to the couple described their relationship as deeply affectionate and mutually supportive. They had a genuine partnership based on respect, explains Colbert biographer Bernard Dick. Joel admired her talent and work ethic. She respected his intelligence and dedication to medicine. Neither tried to invade or control the other's professional sphere. Their marriage lasted until Pressman's death in 1968, one of Hollywood's most enduring unions despite the apparent mismatch in both appearance and professional interests. After his death, Colbert never remarried, suggesting that she had found in this outwardly ordinary man something extraordinary that she never expected to find again. Maybe Claudette understood something that many in Hollywood never grasp, reflects Thompson. That lasting happiness has little to do with physical beauty or public perception, and everything to do with mutual respect, shared values, and that to see each other as complete human beings rather than images on a screen.
Picture two.
11. Tallulah Bankhead and John Emery. Tallulah Bankhead defied every convention of her era. The Alabama-born actress shocked society with her bisexuality, her uninhibited language, her heavy drinking and drug use, and her general disregard for the rules that governed proper female behavior in the early 20th century. With her husky voice, theatrical manner, and striking looks, Bankhead created a persona as much as a career, becoming famous for being Tallulah as much as for any particular performance. Given her larger-than-life personality and boundary-pushing lifestyle, Bankhead's 1937 marriage to actor John Emery seemed particularly incongruous, not just because of their physical mismatch, but because conventional matrimony seemed so at odds with her free-spirited nature. It was less a marriage, more a magic trick gone wrong. Emery, a classical stage actor who later appeared in films like Spellbound and Rocket Ship XM, was described by contemporaries as distinguished-looking rather than handsome, code for a man whose appearance was more academic than attractive. With his receding hairline, thin build, and generally stiff demeanor, he presented a stark contrast to Bankhead's flamboyant vitality. He looked more like Tallulah's accountant, or perhaps her uncle, than her lover, observed one theater colleague. People who knew Tallulah's romantic history were completely baffled by her choice. That romantic history was extensive and varied. Bankhead had been linked to numerous men and women, including actresses Ava Le Gallienne and Patsy Kelly, writer Mercedes D'Acosta, and various male actors and directors. Her sexual appetites were legendary, as was her witty candor about them. When asked if her marriage to Emery meant she was giving up women, Bankhead reportedly quipped, "Don't be ridiculous, darling. Marriage is one thing, pleasure another." The marriage itself was tumultuous from the start, with neither party making significant adjustments to their independent lifestyles. Bankhead continued her hard partying ways, and likely her extramarital affairs, while Emery pursued his own career and social interests separately from his wife. It was a marriage in name only after the first few months, claimed one friend of the couple. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate friends, and increasingly separate lives. The only surprising thing was that it lasted as long as it did. The union officially ended in divorce in 1941 after just 4 years. Bankhead never remarried, instead returning to her unencumbered lifestyle and delivering the memorable assessment, "Marriage is a career which has its compensations only for those women who do not possess any others." What remains fascinating about the Bankhead-Emery match is how thoroughly it defied expectations, not just in the visual incongruity of the flamboyant actress and her staid-looking husband, but in the very concept of Bankhead entering into traditional matrimony at all. The marriage was doomed from the start, reflects theater historian Helen Brooks, not because of how Emery looked, but because Bankhead was constitutionally incapable of conforming to any conventional structure, including marriage. She was a true original in an era that demanded conformity from women, and ultimately, her authentic self couldn't be contained by matrimony, regardless of who her husband was. After their divorce, Emery would go on to marry and divorce actress Tamara Giva, while Bankhead continued building her legend through performances on stage, screen, and radio, and through her infamous one-liners and outrageous behavior. When she died in 1968, her final words were reportedly codeine, bourbon, a fitting epitaph for a woman who lived entirely on her own terms. Conventional appearances be damned.
Honey, day and night. Aren't we, honey? Margot.
12. Betty Davis and William Grant Sherry. By 1945, Bette Davis had firmly established herself as one of Hollywood's most formidable talents, a two-time Academy Award winner, known for her intense performances, distinctive eyes, and willingness to play unsympathetic characters. Her personal life had been equally dramatic, including a bitter divorce from her first husband Harmon Nelson, and a tumultuous marriage to Arthur Farnsworth that ended with his tragic death in 1943. When Davis married artist William Grant Sherry in 1945, it created one of Hollywood's most visually and temperamentally mismatched couples, a pairing that would produce both Davis's only biological child and one of her most troubled relationships. He painted canvases, she painted red flags. Sherry, a former boxer turned artist, was physically imposing, tall, ruggedly handsome in an unpolished way, and significantly younger than Davis. But contemporary accounts suggest his appearance quickly deteriorated during their marriage, with Davis later describing him as increasingly grimy and unkempt as his artistic aspirations gave way to alcoholism and volatility. Bill was the antithesis of Hollywood refinement, notes Davis biographer Barbara Leeming. He was rough-hewn, crude in his mannerisms, and increasingly disheveled as their marriage progressed. Next to Bette's carefully maintained appearance and regal bearing, he looked completely out of place in her world. The physical mismatch reflected deeper incompatibilities. Davis was Hollywood royalty, disciplined, professional, and accustomed to deference. Sherry was temperamental, unpredictable, and apparently threatened by his wife's success and independence. He had a chip on his shoulder about Bette's fame and fortune from the beginning, explains Leeming. He would alternate between boasting about being married to Bette Davis and resenting living in her shadow. It was a toxic dynamic that brought out the worst in both of them. The situation deteriorated further after the birth of their daughter, Barbara Davis Sherry, later known as B.D. Hyman, in 1947. Davis claimed that Sherry became increasingly abusive, both verbally and physically, during this period, allegations that Sherry denied, but that many of Davis's friends believed. The marriage became a war zone, recalls one Davis confidant. Bill would deliberately antagonize Bette, knowing exactly which buttons to push to provoke her legendary temper. Then, he'd use her reactions to paint her as the unstable one. Davis filed for divorce in 1950, ending a 5-year marriage that she would later describe as her most traumatic. The split became even more painful when Sherry promptly married Davis's former assistant, Marion Richards, a betrayal that the actress took as evidence of a long-standing conspiracy against her. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Davis-Sherry marriage is that it represented Davis's attempt to create a conventional family life during what should have been the prime of her career. Instead, it became a painful chapter that affected both her professional and personal life for years to come. Bette wanted what many successful women want, a supportive partner and a child to love, reflects Leeming. Instead, she found herself with a husband who resented her success and whose appearance and behavior increasingly embarrassed her professionally. It was a painful lesson in how the wrong marriage can undermine every aspect of a woman's life, no matter how accomplished she may be. After their divorce, Sherry largely disappeared from public view, while Davis went on to marry actor Gary Merrill, with whom she adopted 2 more children. The painful chapter with Sherry, however, was never entirely closed, especially after her daughter B.D. published a scathing memoir in 1985 that painted Davis as an abusive mother, reopening old wounds and family conflicts that persisted until Davis's death in 1989.
We would all appreciate it if we could have something other than fried chicken and hard-boiled eggs.
13. Greer Garson and Richard Ney. When Greer Garson married Richard Ney in 1943, the match raised eyebrows throughout Hollywood for multiple reasons. Garson, the elegant British actress who had won America's heart in films like Mrs. Miniver and Random Harvest, was 12 years older than Ney, a significant age gap at a time when such relationships were rare, especially with the woman as the older partner. More startling to audiences was the fact that Ney had played Garson's son in Mrs. Miniver, creating a somewhat unsettling transition from on-screen mother and son to real-life husband and wife. Adding to the incongruity was the stark contrast between Garson's sophisticated, regal beauty and Ney's boyish, somewhat awkward appearance. Audiences were confused. So was she. Greer Garson represented a certain type of elegant, mature womanhood, explains film historian Christina Jenkins. She was the quintessential great lady of the screen, gracious, dignified, the embodiment of feminine strength and refinement. Richard Ney, by contrast, was a gangly young actor just starting his career, with none of the gravitas or sophistication that characterized Garson's public image. The visual mismatch between the statuesque, flame-haired Garson and the somewhat ungainly Ney was compounded by the power dynamic in their relationship. Garson was at the peak of her career, one of MGM's highest-paid stars and a critical darling. Ney was a virtual unknown whose most significant role had been playing her son. MGM was horrified by the relationship, notes Jenkins. They tried to discourage it, fearing it would damage Garson's carefully cultivated image. Studio head Louis B. Mayer reportedly told her, "You're America's mother, for God's sake. You can't marry your son." Despite studio pressure, Garson and Ney married on July 24, 1943, just one day after her divorce from her first husband was finalized. The hasty timing fueled rumors that Garson might be pregnant, though no child materialized. From the beginning, the marriage faced significant challenges beyond the age gap and appearance disparity. Ney struggled with living in Garson's shadow, allegedly referring to himself bitterly as Mr. Greer Garson. His acting career failed to flourish, creating resentment as Garson continued to receive accolades and lucrative roles. Richard couldn't handle being the less successful partner, claimed one friend of the couple. He wanted to be seen as Garson's equal, but the industry and the public never viewed him that way. He was always Greer Garson's young husband, rather than an actor in his own right. The marriage lasted just 4 years before ending in divorce in 1947. Ney would later reinvent himself as a successful investment counselor and author, finding the recognition in finance that had eluded him in Hollywood. Garson, meanwhile, married Texas oil executive Buddy Fogelson in 1949, beginning a union that would last until his death in 1987. Friends noted that Fogelson, wealthy, confident, and established in his own right, provided the equal partnership that had been impossible with Ney. The Garson-Ney marriage failed for reasons that went far beyond their physical mismatch, reflects Jenkins, but that visual incongruity, the elegant, mature actress, and her gangly, boyish husband, symbolized deeper incompatibilities that neither of them could overcome. Sometimes what looks mismatched on the surface is equally mismatched beneath. 14. Norma Shearer and Irving Thalberg. In the pantheon of Hollywood power couples, few match the influence of Norma Shearer and Irving Thalberg. Their marriage united MGM's First Lady of the Screen with its legendary boy wonder producer, a partnership that shaped the studio's golden era and produced some of cinema's most enduring classics. Yet physically, they presented one of Hollywood's most striking contrasts. The luminous actress with her carefully cultivated beauty, and the frail, chronically ill executive who looked decades older than his actual age. The queen of MGM married the wizard behind the curtain. Shearer, with her distinctive beauty and indomitable determination, had overcome initial rejection, including being told her eyes were too far apart and her legs too short for stardom, to become one of Hollywood's most successful actresses. By the time she married Thalberg in 1927, she was already a major star, known for both her acting talents and her meticulous attention to her image. Thalberg, despite his extraordinary power as MGM's head of production, cut a far less impressive physical figure. Thin and pale due to the congenital heart condition that would eventually kill him at age 37, he looked perpetually exhausted with deeply shadowed eyes and a fragile build that belied his iron will and creative genius. Physically, they were complete opposites, notes MGM historian Mark Vieira. Norma was vital, energetic, radiantly healthy, the picture of Hollywood glamour. Irving was gaunt, sickly, and looked 10 years older than his actual age. They looked more like patient and nurse than husband and wife. What the public couldn't see, however, was the intellectual and creative connection that transcended this physical disparity. Thalberg recognized and nurtured Shearer's ambitions, casting her in increasingly challenging roles that showcased her range beyond mere prettiness. Shearer, in turn, provided Thalberg with emotional support and a partner who understood both the creative and business sides of filmmaking. Theirs was a true meeting of minds, explains Vieira. Irving wasn't conventionally handsome, but he possessed something far more attractive to someone of Shearer's ambition and intelligence: the power to shape careers and the vision to create great films. For Shearer, that was more seductive than any leading man's profile. The marriage produced 2 children and a string of classic films in which Shearer starred, including The Divorcee, for which she won an Academy Award, A Free Soul, and The Barretts of Wimpole Street. Throughout their partnership, Thalberg's health remained precarious, requiring frequent rest cures and limiting their social life. When Thalberg died in 1936 after a series of heart attacks, Shearer was devastated. Though she would eventually remarry to ski instructor Martin Arrouge in 1942, friends noted that she never fully recovered from losing her most important creative partner and supporter. After Irving's death, something essential went out of Norma's career and life, observed one colleague. She continued acting for several years, but the special magic that had characterized her films under his guidance was diminished. They had truly been greater together than apart. The Shearer-Thalberg marriage illustrates how Hollywood unions often served purposes far beyond conventional romantic attraction. In an industry where power, creativity, and career advancement were inextricably linked, physical appearance might be far less important than shared ambitions and complementary talents. Looking at photographs of them together, the physical mismatch is striking, reflects Vieira, but understanding what they created together, both personally and professionally, reveals a deeper compatibility that transcended surface appearances. Sometimes the most powerful attractions are invisible to the camera.
One of the things that he admired is the fact that Thalberg never took a screen credit.
15. Barbara Stanwyck and Frank Fay. Before Barbara Stanwyck became one of Hollywood's most formidable actresses, renowned for her versatility, professionalism, and unflinching portrayals of strong women, she was Ruby Stevens, an orphaned girl from Brooklyn fighting for survival. Her 1928 marriage to vaudevillian Frank Fay represented both her entry into show business and the beginning of a relationship that would eventually inspire one of cinema's most iconic stories of ambition and cruelty. She was fire, he was dead weight. Fay, once billed as the charlatan of comedy, had been a successful vaudeville headliner before bringing Stanwyck to Hollywood. Physically, he presented a stark contrast to Stanwyck's earthy beauty. With his thinning hair, perpetually reddened face, exacerbated by heavy drinking, and increasingly bloated appearance, Fay looked every bit the aging performer struggling to maintain relevance as his career declined. Frank Fay represented a dying breed of entertainer, explains film historian Robert Mattson. He was a vaudeville comic whose style, smug, superior, often mean-spirited, didn't translate well to film. Physically, he grew increasingly unattractive as his alcoholism worsened, developing that puffy, florid complexion characteristic of heavy drinkers. This physical deterioration paralleled his career trajectory. While Fay had initially been the more successful partner, bringing Stanwyck to Hollywood as his wife, their fortunes quickly reversed. Stanwyck's natural talent and fierce work ethic propelled her to stardom, while Fay's career stalled, creating a dynamic that his ego couldn't tolerate. Fay couldn't handle Stanwyck's success, notes Mattson. His response was increasingly abusive behavior, alcoholic rages, physical violence, public humiliation. He became the textbook example of a man whose masculinity was threatened by his wife's success and who tried to reassert control through domination and cruelty. Friends reported witnessing Fay's physical abuse of Stanwyck at parties, slapping her, pushing her, pouring drinks over her head, behaviors that grew worse as his own career declined and hers flourished. The contrast between the increasingly powerful roles Stanwyck played on screen and her subjugation at home created a painful dissonance in her life. Barbara was portraying these strong, independent women in films like Babyface and Ladies of Leisure, while coming home to a man who was trying to break her spirit, explains Stanwyck biographer Victoria Wilson. The irony wasn't lost on her, but like many abuse victims, she struggled to break free of the dynamic. The marriage finally ended in 1935, after Faye's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. Stanwyck, who had initially been devoted to him despite his abuse, finally reached her breaking point when his alcoholism and cruelty threatened to destroy both her career and her sense of self. What makes the Stanwyck-Faye marriage particularly significant in Hollywood history is how directly it influenced one of cinema's greatest films. Their relationship, the rising female star, the alcoholic husband consumed by jealousy and self-pity, became the template for A Star is Born, first filmed in 1937 and remade multiple times since. Everyone in Hollywood knew that A Star is Born was based on Stanwyck and Faye, notes Wilson. The core story, an ambitious young woman marrying an older established star only to eclipse him professionally as he descends into alcoholism and self-destruction, was essentially their marriage with the names changed. After their divorce, Stanwyck's career continued to flourish through 4 decades of memorable performances, while Faye faded into obscurity, his once prominent name becoming little more than a footnote in Stanwyck's biography. She would marry only once more, to actor Robert Taylor, in a union that lasted from 1939 to 1952, and spent the last 40 years of her life single by choice. The Faye marriage taught Stanwyck a brutal lesson about how quickly attraction can turn to revulsion when character is rotten, reflects Wilson. She never forgot it, and it shaped both her career choices and her personal relationships for the rest of her life.